it's as self-evident, many may think. For instance, there's a tendency to confuse social policy with social protection and so on and so forth. And then I'll run quickly through what I call the endogenous norms of social policy and the colonial social policy in the colonial context. Very briefly, some of the highlights of the social policy in the immediate post-colonial context, and then come round to the discussion of the rise of what, to quote a good colleague of mine, Andrew Fisher, what is called stratified, segmented, and segregated social policy in a very residual manner, and then highlight what I call the antinomies, of social policy response to COVID-19 in a way to demonstrate what I call the antinomies of stratified, segregated, and segmented social policy. So let me start off by, because of what I call an introduction to the very idea of social policy. I have defined it as collective public efforts at affecting, in other words, creating and protecting, not to creating the, of social well-being of people within a given territory. And normally, social policy in this context is concerned with norms, regulations, statutes, institutions through which a country or a territory seeks to create, promote, enhance, and protect the well-being of people within the territory. You may refer to this thing as, welfare, but I prefer, well-being, as such. And it is important to understand that it's not simply what the state does. It's not simply what public authority does. We have social policy provisioning through family, through communities, through the markets, and so on and so forth. And it's in the relation to the latter that has been the fundamental major, what John Toye referred to as counter-revolution in development thinking, counter-revolution in social policy provisioning happened in the 1980s in many African countries. But it is not simply about citizen or citizenship. It's about the provision in the rights. Maybe some rights may be allocated to on the basis of citizenship. Most access to most issues around social policy are not restricted to citizenship. That's why I am very dubious about the idea that an expansive social policy is something called social citizenship, because it's not simply about citizenship. And it's important to keep in mind that social policy itself reflects the dominant norms, the normative framework, ideational orientation in a society, the balance of power among the social forces in policy making, especially public policy making, because it's this contestation historically that sometimes is hidden, that we don't see, that shapes and defines the inherited social policy architecture that we may be looking at, and so on and so forth. And social policy, for instance, has 5 concerns. The late Professor Thandika Mkandawire, who's a leading scholar in this area in the African context and globally, identified the first 4, which is that social policy is concerned with the redistributive effect of economic policy. What happens, with policy is how do you allocate the proceeds of economic activity and economic policy? It's about the protection of people from the vagaries of the market and the changing circumstances of life. It's about enhancement. This is important, as we will find later, enhancement of the productive potential of members of society. And the norm of the gender component of social policy is that social policy has to be concerned with what Kadawire called the reconciliation of the burden of reproduction without a further social task. otherwise we find situations where care, is excessively the burden that women carry, and reconciling the reproduction of the population with social reproduction and social policy through public investment, through changing in the norms of gender relations and so on and so forth, will seek to reconcile the burden of reproduction, pregnancy, giving birth to baby, nurturing babies, and so on and so forth, with other social tasks to give women, the same, equitable access to a range of opportunities and resources in society. I have emphasized a fifth concern, not because Professor Mkandawire did not, was unaware of these, but it didn't figure in his four concerns of social policy, and it's about the social policy. A concern of social policy is about enhancing social cohesion, what in the African context is called the nation building project. And we will find out that this was a fundamental, very important, task allocated to social policy instrument in post-colonial African context, and so on and so forth. And therefore, when we look at it in terms of what we call the tasks of social policy, the production task, the protection task, the redistribution task, the reproduction, and the nation building and social cohesion task. And social policy here, then this is quite important to keep in mind, that social policy involves a diversity of instruments. Social policy is the effort to respond to the social question in society, to answer social questions, to respond to social issues, and to emphasize and reinforce and create and protect the well-being of people, and this will range from issues about education, health and sanitation, housing, land and agrarian policy, because most efforts around land, land reform, agrarian reforms, is concerned with enhancing the well-being of people, either new farming community, or in context of land to the tillers. Question of equity in labor markets. The whole idea of the concept of decent work, which talks not only to issues of living wage, but adequate social security, in terms of and often not immediately understood as a social policy device or social policy instrument, is equity and affirmative action. Gender equity. Affirmative action, and then you look at things like family policy, which is not always the same thing as child policy, old age policy, pan-territorial pricing, in a way in which, across a country, which is something that was very common in the early post-colonial, context, where there was an attempt to ensure access at the same price to basic commodities, regardless of where you are, in the country, precisely because of and that also has the implication in terms of the nation building concern that underpins the social policy regime. And I think to get a sense of what I may call layers of understanding of this thing, I use what I call the parable of the nested Russian doll, to help, in terms of transcending the misconceptions around social policy and social protection and social assistance and so on and so forth. We can think of social policy as the bigger doll on the outside, a component of which is social protection, concerned often with the protection tasks of social policy. And social assistance is a subset of social protection, because we can have various social protection instruments, such as social security, social assistance, in other words, contributory instruments like health insurance, what do you call it, pension, contributory pension system, and so on and so forth. Social assistance is a component of social protection concerned with protecting or responding to vulnerability, but which is generally funded from public resources. It's non-contributory in nature, and therefore, as I will find later, the post-structure, the obsession within the neoliberal context with social assistance and the tendency for people who promote social protection to actually be talking about social assistance, not even social protection, much less social policy. So for a center like Center for Social Policy Studies and this, it is important that we have this more comprehensive understanding of, and therefore the layered, meaning of many of these, categories, and so on and so forth. Now, what is quite crucial, and this is important, is that it's not one particular instrument. When we look at a social policy regime, a regime of creating, enhancing, protecting, defending the well-being of people. It is not one thing or another thing that defines. The concern has to be around the social policy architecture of in other words, the ways in which the interconnectedness of diverse social policy instrument, your education instrument, what are the norms that underpin it, your health instrument, what are the norms that underpin it, housing and this, that, sanitation, fiscal policy, what are the norms that underpin it, and the way in which these are interconnected and in lockstep, work in lockstep. So it's not specifically about one specific instrument, but the synergy between diverse instruments. And quite crucial here is the normative underpinning of the architecture, the degree of the synergistic connection between economic and social policy. I always argue, you cannot push for economic policy based on the pursuit of selfish interest, and then want to put on top of that a social policy based on solidarity. It doesn't work, and more coherent social policy regimes are the ones where the norms, the normative underpinning of social policy is the same with the normative underpinning of economic policy, and so on, And for this reason, as a good friend of mine, Michael Noble once said, a social policy design is not like shopping in a supermarket. And we tend to have a situation where the disparate instruments with different principles and norms underpinning them are just bundled together. And what you end up with is a particular normative underpinning will become dominant in one particular area, and some of the more, say, for instance, solidaristic ones that talks about norms of solidarity, mutuality, and things like that gets underrepresented and gets diminished in their effect and their impact. All right. Now, and this is quite important. Social policy instruments, especially in the context that I will talk about later of transformative social policy, are not about public goods. We know in the, what do you call it, Samuelson's notion of public goods as collective consumption of goods, where each individual's consumption of such goods does not lead to the subtraction from any other individual's consumption of the same good. Rather, I will argue that it's important for us, especially in the post-COVID environment, a post-neoliberal context on the African continent, in one that is focused on addressing the structural underpinnings of vulnerability, of poverty, of this, what do you call it, underdevelopment, that we understand that social policy instrument ought to be social and understood as social and economic commons. because they involve the idea of a collective common good, not goods, common good, collective common good, where equity rather than non-excludability in Samuelson's notion of public goods or non-rivality in Samuelson's notion of public good is the determinate condition of access. In a situation where access may be structured on the basis of gravity of need rather than presentation of demand. And this is particularly evident in health, what do you call it, service, where you have what do you call it, private health systems and things like that. You tend to get a situation where the segment of the population with less burden, what do you call it, health burden, actually overconsumes, health services, and there's a segment of the population because they have access to what do you call it, private insurance and so on and so on. Whereas the segment of the population where the burden of disease is highest underconsumed. So in the case of South Africa, for instance, you find out that although the country spent about 8.2, 8.8%, depending on the year you're looking at, on healthcare, for instance, something about 16 to 18% of the population consumes more than 50% of health expenditure in the private sector, and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of thing you will find in where, what do you call it, private health insurance is used, and private health provisioning and something. I mean, a clear example is to look at health expenditure in the United States and health outcome. United States has probably the highest health expenditure per capita, with health outcome that, in fact, in many cases are inferior to that of Cuba. And that's likely because of the privatized, private nature of the dominant, not necessarily exclusively, because you have Medicare and Medicaid, but the dominant, structure is that of private health system, Now, I'll just go through this side in terms of, just to give a speedy, what do you call it, overview in terms of what you call the evolution of social policy in Africa. And I think we can talk about, endogenous norms that are there to sustain well-being. I haven't used traditional, and I haven't used pre-colonial, because in many cases, what we call tradition is not traditional. What we call, it's sometimes a lot of invention of tradition and so on and so forth. I've used endogenous in that there are norms that actually in here in society. They might have depleted over time. They might have been eroded over time, but they're there. And I think here make reference to Nyerere and what do you call it? Nkrumah, for instance, where in terms of what we may call the meta-narratives of the norms of mutuality and generosity. It's not that you don't have, what the countervailing social norms and this, but in terms of what we may call the thing that kind of immediately frame the way in which this kind of social relations are organized, the norms of mutuality and generosity are there. And Nyerere once said, for instance, that the great achievement in which is the one in which of the society, the one in which everyone has a sense of security and universal hospitality on which they rely, was this, that every member of society contributed his or her own fair share of effort toward the production of its wealth, and is then supported and protected by the rest of society. Now, it's important to keep in mind that similar to social democratic, welfare regimes, the norms of generosity and mutual support in this particular endogenous context actually abhors idlers. I mean, we talk about disability, but I grew up in a context in which disability did not preclude or inhibit people from being productive. You have, so on and so on and so forth. And Nyerere drew on a Kiswahili proverb to make this point, which says that, treat your guest as a guest for 2 days. On the third day, give him a hoe. he needs to contribute to the well-being of the community. And Kwame Nkrumah, for instance, had raised this in terms of the spirit of communalism, which is crystallized in the humanism and in its reconciliation of the individual advancement with group welfare. And there are illustrative cases of this. If you grew up in rural context, somebody of my generation, we still remember situations where age groups and this that do rotation, where they will go around and clear the farm and help members, plant or harvest. And all you have to do is to provide the food and the drinks that they will have at them. There's something in my maternal, lineage. What they call a bonchonle, and in a situation in which where adversity, affects a member of the lineage, a meeting is held, and even if you can't be there physically, I'm here in South Africa. This is in Western Nigeria, and I still get this thing where they said, they allocate. This is what it costs to deal this, whether it's bereavement, burial, marriage, or some other things. And this is what it costs to the total cost of this thing. We allocate this amount through the lineage for contributions towards completing it. In other words, individual members of the lineage are not left to bear the burden on their own. And there are things like what is called rotational saving and credits, what we call a susu, for instance, which is a form of social insurance. But more importantly is the lineage network and support system. In the village, somebody's child gets admitted into the college in the big city and this and that, and village members will contribute little things here and there. I want a very interesting story about the University of Zambia being established, and Kaunda and the UNIP going around the country, promoting the question about the need to build a new university, because here you had a country with a mine whose economy was basically mining, and it didn't have a single indigenous mining engineer at the point of independence. And in the campaign throughout the country, the going around, the people who are contributing dry fish. Okay, now don't think that dry fish will build this university, but the whole idea of the common norms of mutuality and support becomes quite important. And of course, you can talk in terms of the colonialism. The colonial logic is what we may call the logic of extractivism. It's fundamentally, we talk about the colonialism in terms of epistemology and so on and so forth. So it's fundamentally an economic, extractive project and so on and so forth. And the colonial extractivism itself, was coupled with severe underinvestment in the social policy infrastructure of the colonies. There was a stratified system of social provision between the colonists and the indigenous population. Social services, especially health, education, initially were farmed out largely to missionary and religious bodies and so on and so forth, and who are more concerned in terms of using that for proselytization processes and so on and so forth. To give us as an example, for instance, at independence, Nigeria, with a population of 45 million, had only one university, called University College, affiliated with the University of London, which had 1,000 students in a population of 45 million. There's a lot of talk about how African universities, especially in the decolonial discourse and things like that, almost like vestiges of epistemic dependence. But the higher education and education generally, you guys know this in case of Ghana, 1950s, and 1960 and so on and so on, that the higher education was a fundamental project of the post-colonial government. And this, now you do find situations where the settler colonial regimes, for instance, in say Southern Africa, in Kenya, and so on and so forth, Algeria in Northern Africa, and this, had a stratified system social provisioning, a particular system, on the basis of race, for the settlers, and then a different one for what do you call it, the indigenous population, and a clear driving force of the anti-colonial struggle itself, which we call the anti-colonial social compact, or a social pact, and the coalition. And we may remember this, that a prevailing, what they call the mantra, which continued until, into the ANC coming into power in South Africa in 1994, is the idea of a better life for all. That the post-colonial agenda is about defeating the triple burden of ignorance, poverty, and disease. And there was a clear-cut, connection of social policy and economic development. I mean, you look at some of the development plans and so on and so forth. They're understood in terms of the way in which you connect the investment in education and what do you call it? The human resource capacity that you build, the focus on engineers, doctors, teachers, nurses, and so on and so forth. And that these are also resources that you need for your economic development. And it is the virtuous circle between your social policy and your economic development that you try to, that many of them try to develop. And that was a clear agenda. Now, you might not have had the old age, social pension, or what do you call it, cash transfer, in the way we understand it today, except for Mauritius and so on and so forth. And this, but this was a more expansive understanding of social policy and the different instruments of social policy. There was, as I said earlier on, massive expansion in education. If there is one thing that the post-colonial, governments got right, they got education rights. It wasn't so much an understanding of education purely in its, what they call, activation as a device for human resource capacity building and this. Otherwise, how will you explain the emphasis on adult literacy? As late as what they call 1980s, in the case of Zimbabwe, for instance, where night schools were created for people, for older people to understand literacy and numeracy and so on and so forth. And in the language of the action group in Western Nigeria in the 50s, it was understood that education is vital for the quality of democracy that you have and the quality of citizenship. If no matter what the degradation that happened subsequently, and the same thing in terms of investment in public health. And I remember this in the case of Nigeria, still lasted until the late 70s, where tertiary level healthcare at the university college, was free at the point of use. When I had, my appendectomy as an undergraduate at University of Ibadan, my parents were not there to pay. I was rushed to the hospital. My operation was done. When they finally reached my dad and he came, and they were waiting for a medication. I was tubes all over, in me, and said, with a machine on the ground running to extract this out of me. And they said there was a medication that I needed, and they had gone to the pharmacy, but they hadn't come back. And in his anxiety, my dad went across to the pharmacy, on the private pharmacy across the road from the University Teaching Hospital, UCH, to buy this thing. When I left the hospital, when I was discharged, I got a refund for the medication that my dad bought. Okay. Few years later, under structural adjustment, not only is it that you couldn't simply just go to hospital, there were all sort of, what you call a co-payment system. And if you were to go to hospital, you have to go with, two other people, one to stay with you and one to be going from one kiosk to the next to pay all this, amount to them. And there was an attempt to expand social security. In Nkrumah's 1965, it's a clear example of this, which got abandoned by the government, military government and the subsequent government that came, until the 80s and so on and so forth. Mauritius, for instance, is the one that has a far more expansive approach to social policy on the continent. And you can say the same thing for Seychelles and more later, what they call it, Cape Verde, and social policy was also understood as an instrument for social cohesion and nation building. The problem is, of course, that there were, most of the system at the time and social policy, framing were gender blind. I mean, if you to look at many of the parties, CCP, Chama Mapinduzi, what was TANU at the time, that had women's wing and things like that. But there was very little effort to drive through, women's rights in terms of, for instance, equitable inheritance, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the fiscal and debt crisis of the late 1970s led to the unbundling of post-colonial aspirations, And as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of the use of, what do you call it? A clear example was the use of education as a vehicle for nation building. And I'll just use the example of Tanzania, where in the late 1960s and 70s, for instance, they had a system where they moved secondary school students from, one region, say for instance, the southern region, to go to school in the northern region, a boarding system and so on and so forth, and where they will interact with the local community. They will have different people from different backgrounds, from different regions, different ethnic groups, and this, be schooled together. And I remember, a colleague that I interviewed, for the project around this, Senkore said, he actually began to realize the implication of this much later. But it was fundamental. It was a component, all right, but it was fundamental to the effort of developing a Tanzanian national identity in a country with 100 ethnic groups and 4 racial categories. Of Black Africans, Indians, Europeans, and Afro-Arab, population, and so on and so forth. And yet, in the way in which, Mahmoud Bamdani has argued, Tanzania is arguably Africa's most successful nation-building project. And it's one in which no one group has victimized another. We'll remember that when the people who are talking about Africanization in the early 60s were pushing the agenda, where they push out all the, the Indians, push out all the Europeans. I mean, Nyerere resigned as premier to go back to the party and tour the country and this and that, and then came back 2 years later to take over the premiership of Tanzania. Again, a similar thing is the establishment of the unity schools in Nigeria. But I think this is just, Kandawure, for instance, has produced a typology of welfare regimes in Africa, framed around Samir Amin's classification of what he calls Africa's micro-region. So in the 1972 piece published in Journal of Modern African Studies, for instance, Samir Amin had this classification of 3 macro regions in Africa, what he called Africa of the colonial trade economy, or what Kandawure called Africa of cash crop economies, and then Africa of the concession owning companies. Africa of the colonial trade regime is kind of coincide mainly with West African cash crop economies and this. Africa of the concession owning companies, mainly the Congo Basin area, where the whole territories were concessioned out to mining companies and so on. And then what they call Africa of the labor reserve, mainly Southern Africa and part of East Africa and so on and so forth. And in Kandawure's 2016, there were 2 papers, one in 2016, one in 2020, social welfare typology, which relies on the earlier 2010 paper on what they call tax efforts. Actually, argued that the tax efforts, forms of social expenditure, were part of what they call inherited colonial something, something, and the Southern African countries, what you may call the Africa of the Labor Reserve, largely demonstrate greater tax effort. And then was able to establish a link between what they call the fiscal regime, tax effort, and welfare spending, and argued in the 2020 paper, which was published as a chapter in a book on what they call domestic resource mobilization by UNRIS, which was edited by Kajahujo, came out in 2020. So about labor reserve economies are generally high tax, high social expenditure, context and this, and the cluster analysis that it developed, actually produced distinct clusters, that largely contain countries of the trade, economies in one, block, and those of labor reserves in another block and this. But I mentioned earlier on about the fiscal and the debt crisis that led to the unbundling of what do we call the post-colonial project. Now, of course, that's unbundled much earlier in Ghana than say, for instance, say Nigeria, and unbundled, midway through in Zambia, much earlier, say, for instance, than Zimbabwe. But it's what I refer to as the following, my good friend Andrew Fisher's concept of stratified, segmented, and segregated social policy. This came with what I call the first wave neoliberalism, structural adjustment on the continent, and this, which was conceived in terms of getting the price right. That was the mantra of get the price right and everything will follow, and this, which involved a question of stabilization. In other words, you cut the quote not according to the size, but according to the piece of cloth available. The whole idea of counter-cyclical spending simply did not, the kind of thing that people do now, the same people who enforce the deflationary, macroeconomic framework on Africa, could go back and talk about quantitative easing, which is essentially counter-cyclical spending, which involved initially stabilization and then a more extensive, more enduring regime of liberalization. And it involved in the first wave severe retrenchment of public spending. Education, for instance, spending in Nigeria dropped from what they call 8% of GDP in 1980 at a higher level of GDP and national income to about 1.6% by 1987. Okay, there was little concern at this period for the idea of poverty and vulnerability. Then came in what they may call the second wave neoliberalism, which coincided with what they call the social dimensions of adjustment, which was in response to the international outrage of the cost of adjustment. An example was the publication of the UNICEF work around adjustment with human face, which mobilized international something about there's a need to address the deleterious entitlement failure that structural adjustment was imposing on people in the African countries. I mean, we had a situation in Nigeria where poverty fell from about 36% to 28% between 1970 and 1980, and then grew from 28% to 64% by 2010. Under adjustment. Under the second wave neoliberalism, and this is where we come to the current environment milieu of social policy, social assistance, social protection. Safety net was offered as a response to mass entitlement failure. And over the period, moving into what we may call the third wave neoliberalism, it has moved from temporary safety net support to talking about predictable regular transfer to the most vulnerable. And the focus here is what is called extreme poverty. But often, when you look at actual number of people who are in extreme poverty and actual number of people covered by social assistance of the safety net, and they say there's a disparity. Usually the coverage is much less than the actual proportion of the population. Not to talk about the people who are in poverty themselves, not to talk about the people who are technically non-poor, but are precariously so, and can be easily flushed now into poverty and so on and so forth. Now, what has then happened in the system of regimentation of stratified, segmented social policy is the entrenchment of liberalization and market logic in the provisioning, in social provisioning, to the point that even in public facilities, what you have is market transactional logic for service provisioning. You had and the same hospital that when I was an undergraduate at University of Badon, that I went in for operation and got a refund because my dad had bought medication which should have been supplied by the hospital, which was to be supplied by the hospital, which was they just went to the pharmacy and in the hospital and they are not back. You have situations where my sister was telling me a few days ago of somebody in the church who had for cancer treatment and went to Lagos State Teaching Hospital, and the first amount they asked for was 250,000 naira as deposit, and it was the church that was mobilizing money to try and pay for this. So the whole logic about that the size of the somebody's right to life depends on the size of their pocket was driven into it. We ended up what we may call stratified system of social provisioning. As an example of that, if you look at what they call private health insurance, private or pension, you have different options available, and which gives you, depend on the breadth of and the nature of healthcare services that you can get. People who depend on community health insurance, for instance, hardly will get anything like dialysis. But if you're CEO of a company, if you're very rich and this and that, you can get a top tier health insurance, which allows you in private health or something, if health quality something is there, to be able to access much extensive something. So it's stratified and it's segmented in that whereas a national social insurance system will pool large something of resources to provide on the basis of need. What you ended up with segregated system of provisioning is that many of these are in small pools, okay, of different options, and it's particularly even notorious in market-based pension systems where there is no possibility of risk pooling. Your contribution goes into your own little account, and it's a function of how much you're able to the investment that comes off it. In the sense, if you're unlucky, you may actually get less for your annuity than total amount you put in. Not to talk about the amount that goes into administration of this small, pools of something. I mean, if you look at the number of companies offering healthcare insurance in Nigeria, or pension fund, and then you have the segregated, the ones that people talk about when they talk about cash transfer, social protection, and it's a social insurance, social assistance rather. It's a segregated system of social provisioning, where public provisioning, non-contributory access to something is walled off to what is called the most vulnerable, which requires that the public performance of poverty by the poor, being able to be publicly identified as poor, having to queue in public to be able to have access to resource, having intrusive identification of to be sure that you actually are poor enough to have access to something. And around this thing is the obsession with leakages, which focuses on the deserving poor. It's not enough for you to be poor. It's not enough to be extremely poor, to be in extreme poverty. You have to be deserving. In other words, if you are, and you see that in some of the social insurance schemes and social assistance schemes. If you have not a labor-deprived household, you do not have access. Okay, and generally the poetry generosity in terms of the provisioning itself, in much of the practice, 20%. If 20% of the total consumption need of a household is given as cash transfer, is considered enough. My argument recently has been to track this in relation to how much on a daily basis, if you disaggregate this to daily basis, will the cash transfer per day relative to the price of the loaf of bread. I don't know who is drawing something on the screen. And I'll just go briefly, and I probably should just kind of just restrict myself to one country because of time, something, what I call the antinomies of segregated social policy. And we can see that in the response to COVID-19. So if you take the example of Nigeria, for instance, the initial, response was to rely on the payment of 2 months, payouts on the basis of the existing national social assistance program, what is called the Household Uplifting Program, which came to 20,000 naira or $55.60 equivalent. The beneficiaries are themselves, would have understood as the most indigent, drawn from the World Bank's designed register of 2.6 million households, about 11 million in the population. When in fact the conservative poverty line estimates that the National Bureau of Statistics itself generated suggests that 40% of the population in Nigeria, which is about anything between 80 and 84 million people, are in poverty. There was a promise to expand the register of the database to 3.6 million, but relative to 84 million, 3.6 million just looks like poverty. This is the point I was saying earlier on about even when you say you are concerned with poverty, the actual coverage is much less. The generosity level of the transfer, amounted to 33 naira per day, and a loaf of bread in Lagos, was 350. Let me. I've spoken about the case with the Novici, what is called solidarity in every language, what's called cash transfer scheme, which was introduced by Togo for informal sector workers, where the selection of beneficiaries from those who applied was only the actual beneficiaries from actual number of people who applied. Only 41% of those who applied, 41.68% of those who applied were actually approved for the thing. And there was 376,108 female beneficiaries and 205 male beneficiaries. The cash transfer itself, to beneficiary was by mobile money, which is creative way of addressing the gaps in access to bank accounts and stuff. And women were given 12,250 CFA, men were given 10,500 CFA and this and that. But if you were to take this and look at a man and a woman who get the money in a household with two children, you end up with an adult equivalent of 3 in a household, which gives you a daily rate of the amount in terms of 147 CFA. And yet a loaf of bread in Lome was 317 CFA. In the South African context, there was, I can talk about a number of these things. We can come back to it in terms of something, because I have only 9 minutes left. But the one that was introduced specifically were 2. One is what it calls a special COVID-19 social relief of distress grant, which came to 350 naira rand, 350 rand per month. Initially supposed to run until October, but now been extended to January and now extended further for another 3 months and things like that. When you look at the generosity level of that amount, it comes to 11 rand 66 cents per day. A loaf of bread alone will be about 15 rand per day. Compare that with the temporary employee-employer relief, which came out of this social insurance, unemployment social insurance scheme, in which companies that had problem paying their staff members, staff workers who are forlorn, for instance, could apply for payment, and the benefit was capped at 17,712 rand per month. And as of October 27, 2020, for instance, 51 billion has been paid to 1 million companies, disbursed in 11.5 million payments. And the generosity level rate is difficult to determine because it has to be replacement rate. The most important thing here is that in a situation where, when you compare what came out of a social insurance, which was a national social insurance managed by public authority, it wasn't managed by market, it wasn't managed by, it was run from the National Department of Employment and Labor. And its ability to respond quite quickly was precisely because it's a public, nationally managed social insurance, managed by the public sector. When you compare that in terms of provisioning, it's relative to the social release of distress, social relief of distress of COVID-19. You can see a significant difference in social insurance and the social assistance, and that itself is because we have ended up in a situation where the idea of the self-worth of people, the dignity of people, for instance, under this regime of cash transfer, for instance, has been so diminished that we can give people money insufficient to buy a loaf of bread, and that is considered good public policy. A lesson of COVID-19 is the need to transcend the regime of stratified, segmented, and segregated social policy. It requires what I will call, and this is a subject for another presentation, another seminar, but I'll just introduce it in the remaining 6 minutes. It's a return to what I call a wider vision of social policy, which borrows from the best experience of social policy in the immediate post-colonial situation and the rest of the world. The idea that when you're building national pension, contributory pension system, for instance, a market logic of it is actually creates a situation where people may end up getting much less in their old age, and nobody's held responsible. Companies, pension system companies set up all over the place, health insurance, and it's big business, and people who are living big, paying themselves generous money, and this is what I relate to what I call what we will understand as transformative social policy, which is driven by norms of equality and social policy, which makes effort to tap simultaneously the multiple tasks of social policy, the production task, the protection task, the reproduction task, the redistribution task, and the social cohesion task, and in which different policy instruments, from fiscal instruments to social insurance, to education, to health, to human settlement, to agrarian reform, labor market, are understood as social policy, which feed into different development outcomes. And the development outcomes, they say, what we know in the nature of social policy history is that, in fact, it creates a positive loop-back effect in sustaining the norms of equality and solidarity that frames the social policy architecture originally. But this will be what do you call it, the basis of a different seminar presentation. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Adesina. I know we gave you a big task. Run us through social policy from colonial to COVID. And somehow you managed to do it in 1 hour. So thank you. This was very, very informative. I'm going to open the floor. So the floor too, you can either raise your hand and open your mic and speak, or you can ask a question through the chat session. While people, I guess, are running their, questions through their minds, maybe trying to figure out how to put it, I had the advantage of knowing your topic and having done some of your readings before. So I have my question prepared. So I'm going to ask it now. So I find the functions of social policy that you lay out, so between you and Mkandarire, very interesting and very, very useful. So it's productive, redistributive, reproductive, protection, cohesion. So when I go through all that and its definitions and the different examples, the question that comes to my mind is, isn't that everything? Isn't the binary between economic and social policy perhaps redundant? Because it seems that if you look at the functions, to me, that's just about everything that we want to do as a society for our individual and collective well-being. So how do you still then talk about social policy as something distinct when it becomes so encompassive, so comprehensive?
Well, I think first of all, okay, it's important to understand that social policy is not a discipline. Social policy is a field. As a field, I'm a sociologist, with some training in economics and political science, and so on, and social policy draws its conceptual, analytical frameworks from economics, sociology, law, and so on and so forth, and so on. And you demarcate a field in terms of what is concerns about. And the concerns of social policy, it's about human well-being. Now, if you think of it in an expansive way, then you have to, then think in terms of what are the things that actually will go into. I mean, there are economic dimensions of the specific areas in which economic policy stands apart from social policy. On labor market, for instance, and this, but when you're looking at the concerns around human well-being in the context of labor market, you focus on what is generally referred to as the notion of decent work in the language of the ILO, a living wage, social security attached to your employment status and employment, but also the whole idea of what they call active labor market policies. In other words, situations where you do not leave people to their own devices, and when as the Swedes, LO will argue, we do not protect the work, we protect the workers. So the whole idea of an active labor market policy, which understands that there will be what do we call the Schumpeterian, creative destruction, idea. That there will be new technologies that will come in. You don't stand in the way of new technologies coming in, but you find ways in which you can retrain workers. You provide, the mechanism through which people can get, look for new job, protect them while they are temporarily unemployed, retrain them, and create a network of labor offices and this and that, where the same person may get maybe in Accra, but the job available is in Kumasi. But you ensure that a system is put in place concerned with the well-being of the individual, that ensures that you can relocate to what do you call it, Kumasi, without loss of something. And when the person relocates, you have to think in terms of the children. You have to think in terms of education. You have to think in terms of housing and so on and so on. So it's a whole network of all these, that thing. Now, you do talk about in terms of what we call welfare economics, economics of welfare, and so on and so forth. But social policy, to be comprehensive, has to comprehensively look at what is necessary for creating an enabling environment for promoting for and protecting the well-being of individuals. So yeah, that's what attracted me to the field. I don't know if that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense. So it's not about delineating certain areas, it's like the economists do economics, social policy do education and so on. It's about the approach and the goal. The goal, yeah. Okay. That absolutely makes sense. With Owusu Amankwa, you have your hand up. So if you can unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. And thank you for this insightful presentation. I've enjoyed it. You made mention of several things. Among other things, you mentioned social insurance versus social assistance. And you have shown us how that has evolved over the years, especially social assistance and social insurance, how contributory social insurance is also part of the whole, the whole story. If you look at contributory social insurance schemes that we have, for instance, in Ghana, and COVID-19 has brought to light the vulnerability that even the people that we considered covered, it has shown how vulnerable they all are. And we haven't seen any way we are using the social insurance system that we have to cushion these people, to cushion these people who have lost, for instance, their job. Because if you look at the contributory social insurance, you have to contribute to a certain, months before you can benefit. So how would you advise us to do as Africans? How can we use contributory social insurance to cushion or to mitigate some of these things? That is my first question. The second question that I want to talk about, if you look at our social, the contributory social insurance, you could see that it is always around, the formal sector. And so we have huge informal sector untouched. How do you advise us to harness this potential to mitigate some of the shocks that some pandemic or other emergencies can bring to affect people, especially the vulnerable? So my first question: how can we use contributory social insurance to cushion or mitigate shocks and emergencies? Then the second one is that how can we tap the rich informal sector to contribute towards some of these shocks and emergencies? Thank you very much.
May I just mention that's Dr. Rita Owusu Amankwa. She coordinates social protection at the Ministry of Genders, Children and Social Protection
Yeah,
in
no,
Ghana. So
yeah.
this is not just an academic question.
I know, and I'm delighted that she raised the question, because let me say fundamentally, and Nana, you know this from my work, that what I think we need on the African continent is to relearn the kind of things that we have taken, that we've been force-fed, okay, over the last 30 years. All right. The South African example that I gave, I mean, and the reason why I flagged that, it's 17,000, but if you look at 17,000 relative to 350,000, they are not the same. It's, in fact, the social insurance, the unemployment social insurance, something in South Africa, is 1% by the employer and 1% by the employee that is contributed. That money has grown, and as I was showing the thing about 500 billion, okay? And they were able to pay over 11.5 million, transactions to respond to the thing. You know, where we need to start from is to tell people, and I use this phrase in a recent paper that I published, don't call dog monkey for me, okay? It's a Yoruba saying, don't see a dog and tell me it's a monkey, okay? Don't come and sell me stories about how I should run and look after the welfare of my people, when in fact, in your own context, you don't do that way. So let's take as an example, for instance, because one of the things that we need to fundamentally deal with to have a more expensive is to change the way the state thinks. I'm a sociologist. That seems like an anomaly to talk about the way the state is not a person. How can the way the state thinks? There are a number of assumptions that we take for granted. First of all, this notion that we can't let people become dependent on welfare. Actually, the most generous welfare regimes in the world also have an environment in which people are most actively engaged in labor market. It's the norm that underpins the thing. It's the notion that all of us are in this together. Okay, you can't have a dislocation of the elite, the people who run the country, from the experience of ordinary people. And we think when we give whatever it is that we give to people, it's like you go back to the village and you distribute little money for people and they clap for you. That's the way in which the state is thinking. Okay, so the whole idea of and this happened in South Africa. I mean, not to talk about Mauritius and so on and so forth, where it was actually ahead of the social grant system that this was rolled out to protect people who are forlorn, who are drop from their employment and so on and so forth, and to dig into the unemployment insurance fund to pay them. Why was it able to do that? Because the unemployment insurance fund is publicly managed. It's publicly invested. And it comes to the question of informal sector. I've heard about the notion that the informality itself is a hindrance to the way in which we can create social insurance. First of all, in the whole transformation of our economy, because this works together, the social policy is supposed to help drive economic development. The economic development then, positively affects your social policy and things like that. The whole idea of a commitment to helping people transition out of informality. Okay, all right. But I grew up knowing that artisans, okay, the way in which they operate, they can levy themselves money. Let me give you one example. During the pro-democracy struggle in Nigeria, we needed to raise money and so on and so forth. Vulcanizers, roadside vulcanizers in Ibadan and Lagos raised 3 million naira within a matter of 1 week. there's a question of the trust that people have and the way in which we work with our own people. What is happening in Ghana now? Take, for instance, the, what do you call it, pension system and this and that. Who are the people going from store to store in Accra trying to get on? Private companies who are offering micro loans, micro pensions. And if you look at the logic of what they are talking about, they're less concerned about the actuarial outcome for the people who are contributing. You contribute, if you contribute 10 cedis, okay, a month, and there are 10 million of you, or 1 million of you contribute 10 cedis, that's 10 million. Which some company, why will the national social economic system think that they cannot do it? Why is it so difficult to get into partnership with markets? Market association, vulcanizers? How is it that vulcanizers on the street side, roadside, who have their own association, can raise 3 million naira in 1994 in Lagos, Ibadan, and then we said no, we can't. So, there's too much informality. Part of it is also the way in which many of us who go abroad to learn, to come, have to de-learn many of the things we learn and this. We're not operating in what we call these formalized economies. How do we make the economy as it is? Why we're thinking of the development agenda? How do we make the thing work for people? How do we mobilize people to invest? To contribute. I grew up knowing that my grand aunt called Mama Dube, and this and that. Every time I visited her in the major markets in the Ibadan, there are these people who ride bicycle, who collect savings. They call them alajo, who collect savings. And I know the way in which they will create.
They call it susu.
Yes, they will collect. They have ledgers, and they set money aside on a daily basis if you want to do your saving on a daily basis, and so on and so forth. And then when you have accumulated the money, you use it to buy stock and this and that for your something. Why is it so difficult for us, state functionaries, academics, to think locally? Why is it that much of the time we're dependent on what somebody from World Bank, somebody who has never run a country, coming to tell you how to run your own country? So my sense is there are two things here. One is the fundamental de-learning of all the things we've learned in the last 30, 40 years, a more expansive understanding. Look, whatever you say about the early nationalists, okay, they had imagination. They had an expansive understanding of what needs to be done. They might not have achieved it. Many of them might have failed. Some have became authoritarian and so on and so forth and this. And it's the return to a more expansive imaginary, what they call it in French, en français, imaginaire, okay? Capacity to imagine that will be the basis for us to get out of this. The world awaits those who have the capacity to think of the future in a new way.
Thank you. So in addition to having imagination and boldness, as Sankara would say, what one of our participants says they had in addition was money. So Esther Asenso Ajamine, you've written your question very well there. Do you want to read it out so that Professor Adesina can respond to it?
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Anidoho. I'm not going to read the question per se, but I want to comment on your transformative social policy framework, and then ask the question linked to what I have posted, that in the framework, the framework seems to overlook the financing agenda. And I think that the financing is important in our context because in a number of instances, the financial resources we get to run the economies of African countries are from outside. And I believe that these have implication for how social policy and economic policy are perceived. What's your take on that? So what hope do we have to generate resources to run our own policies?
I've always said that the red herring, the boogeyman, the one that is used to scare the living daylight out of you is money. Let me give, and this is real story. This is real historical data, historical material. In 1953, in Western Nigeria, after the self-rule was the action group decided that they were going to provide universal free primary education. It's not free, it's publicly financed, publicly funded. and they confronted the issue of money. Money is important. And the initial effort was to say, we will levy every adult £1, pay £1, and we will educate your children. £1 a year. Well, happily, the transition to independence negotiation then transferred all the marketing board surpluses and marketing board to regional government. But it was not that was used. And this is where the interesting thing comes in. In many communities, people got back to the party and said, look, listen, we can build the schools. All you have to do is to provide teachers and the textbooks. We, the communities, we're used to community projects. We'll build roads, we'll build something and so on. We will build the schools, and you provide the teachers, you provide it. I mean, this what I'm telling you, I need you to independently read up on your own, so that we understand when we talk about the question of money and this, because policy making that is anchored in a public imagination of people and interest of people has a way in which it engenders the mobilization of confidence and participation and engagement of people in the communities and this. This is the interesting thing. There are fiscal constraints. The fact that they started the registration of children, and what they thought the enrollment rate they thought they will achieve in 5 years happened in the first year of registration. So what happened? They started creating morning and afternoon schools. So for the same infrastructure, for the same building, for the same school, there will be Ebenezer Primary School A, Ebenezer Primary School B. Teachers, teachers, the textbook that is bought is retained in school to be used in the next class. In other words, you are able to double the capacity of the infrastructure that you have. This is the interesting thing. And again, I need you to check this on your own. There was no foreign loan. There was no foreign, donors. They were not waiting on donors. I worked in the civil service. I don't know what people call, donor something. I don't know when I worked in the civil service. And I don't know what they call consultants, okay? And this is the thing. The regional governments of Action Group in Western Nigeria ran a current account surplus from 1953 to 1959. They ran a current account surplus, budget surplus, with a massive expansion, that a tenfold increase in the number of children enrolled in school, with a minimum wage, with what do you call it, a universal access to healthcare, from what do you call it, from dispensaries in the village to the regional general hospital and the teaching hospitals. Now, the reason why I brought that as an example is this. We're often told that things that need to be done cannot be done because we don't have the money. Again, the world awaits those who have the capacity to imagine a new tomorrow and to think creatively. Now, the remarkable thing, when I look at the age bracket of many of these leading voices in the Action Group Party, you had the Chief Obafemi Awolowo as the leader of government business, the premier of the region. You had the people who are involved in education, the finance, and so on and so forth. They ran budget surplus in context in which they were offering universal primary education, which when they came back into power in 1979, after the military interregnum and this and that, moved it to secondary school level. When I went to university, it was tuition free. In addition to that, you will have access from bursary from your local government, from your state government, and national level. I got what we call 1,000 naira in 1977, 1,000 naira federal government loan. In addition, which was supposed to take care of your, what do you call it, daily needs when in the context of what do you call it, free tuition education and so on and so forth. And that money sustained me for the whole of my second and my third year. In my A-levels, bursary from my local government sustained me and this and that. Again, I come back to the thing. There is a lot that we need to unlearn over the last something. The notion that somehow you have government business, government has to, whatever the private sector can do, government must not do. What do you think the private sector is doing with the money and this and that? All the people who are setting up private health insurance, private insurance, what do you call it, pension, something like this. You know the kind of vehicle that people are riding and what they pay themselves in salary. And yet you know that a national social insurance system reduces the overhead cost of running the insurance system and so on and so forth. So again, I know money is important, but imagination is far more important than the quantum of money that we think we need. When the NEPAD thing started and they were talking about they went to the G8 to go and ask for money, I remember asking Thabo Mbeki, you are asking for 64 billion. Yet the public pension fund in Africa was about a trillion. You think you go and ask somebody else for 64 billion and they'll just hand it over to you without any what do you call it, conditionality. There was a time when slavery was enforced. We're getting to a situation where we're voluntarily handing ourselves over to others to be enslaved. The capacity to imagine a new tomorrow has to start today.
Thank you. Good words to end on. Not that this is the last word on this issue, but obviously not by far. This is why we have a 3-part series, and the 3-part webinar series that we have for this and the next 2 weeks is just the beginning of a conversation that we want to continue. These are, as I said at the beginning, conversations that are being had already. I mentioned that Professor Adesina has been contributing very deeply to these, the kinds of things that he's been talking about, the ways in which we have to reimagine social policy and so on. I think COVID, just as a shock to our system, has given us more impetus and an opportunity to perhaps, because we are all in distress and we're all looking for solutions and we're all imagining the world as a harsher place because of this pandemic, that we are having the kinds of conversations that we should have had more broadly to begin with. So I want to thank Prof. Adesina for starting us off. This has been excellent. The historical overview, the very broad strokes, very useful sort of as a context. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Michael White talk to us about social policy in times of crisis. We are in a time of crisis, but it's always useful to historicize things and realize that we may have been here before. We've had these kinds of experiences. So what is the same, what is different about what we are going through now? What can we learn from previous times, previous places about how we deal with our current moments of crisis on the continent? And then the third in the series would be Professor Georgie Chikata talking about gender equitable and transformative social policy moving forward. And actually, the title of her talk derives from a larger project of which she's the principal investigator and on which Professor Adesina is actually also an advisory board member. So how can we take, again, this moment to have these conversations across the continent, drawing in all kinds of individuals and organizations, including practitioners, members of civil society organizations, and so on. So I do want to assure you, for those of you who are looking at this and seeing a bunch of academics talking, as I said, this is sort of setting the stage, and we want to, going forward, invite practitioners and policymakers to give us perhaps more focused street level view of what is happening. I would like to thank the Ghana Employment and Social Protection Program for funding to do this webinar series. And I know that a couple of them are here, including Sharon Hall. So thank you for the money to have these important conversations. And thank you everybody for being here. And we hope to see you next week. If you've registered once, you don't have to register again. It's the same link that you can use, but we'll send you a reminder. And once again, please join me in thanking Professor Adesina for just giving us a great start to the series. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. That was good.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you and bye.